All right. Hello, this is the undergraduate panel on comparative politics entitled Comparative Politics. We have three presenters today. The first presenter is from Lemoyne College, James Corll. He is going to present a paper entitled An Examination of the Role of Judiciaries in Autocratizing States. Secondly, Shukri Mohammed, again from Lemoyne College, is going to present a paper entitled Naag Nool, Political Struggles of Somali Women in the Liberation Movement and Postcolonial Politics. And finally, Donald Bowen is going to present, again from Lemoyne College, is going to present a paper entitled Commercial Surrogacy and Baby Farming, an International World of Disadvantages and the Need for Global Regulation. Okay, so let's start with James Corll. You have 15 minutes, James. You can share your screen.
Thank you. Yes, I'll do that now. Awesome. I want to confirm everybody can see, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. So for those of you that don't know me, as Dr. Sozin said, my name is James Corll. I'm a freshman at Lemoyne College, and my presentation is entitled The Effect of Populism on American and Turkish Judiciaries. So I wanted to break my paper down to three main components, and that's what my presentation here today is going to be broken down into. The first portion is going to be talking about the judiciary in a modern democracy. First, we're going to be talking about the importance of an independent judiciary in protecting the rights of citizens. And then we're going to be talking about the mixed democracy which we find ourselves in today in the United States of America. And we're going to be talking about how that type of democracy ensures that no one type of government will dominate other branches, and that that will ensure the rights of the people. And we're going to also examine the threats of populism in this system, first in theory, but then we're going to talk about two different case studies. So first, I'll be discussing Turkey. I'll be talking about how a centralization of executive power under President Erdogan has threatened judicial independence. However, I'm also going to discuss how these changes were seen as legitimate on the international stage for a very long time due to approval from the citizenry. And we're also going to be talking about the establishment of judgeships that violates dissidents' rights, most notably criminal peace judgeships. But we'll be talking about that a little bit later. And finally, we'll also be talking about the United States of America. Well, first, I'll be talking about how there were some populist strains of thinking in the early United States, especially in terms of the judiciary. And then I'm going to be discussing two populist threats to the judicial system today. The first is the populism that is present in judicial elections and the increased partisanship that has come with it in recent years, and the increased politicization of the judiciary in election years to appeal to a political base. So first, I want to discuss, why is the judiciary important? We know that it's a branch of government. We know that judges have an important role, but what do they really do and why is it so critical? First, I want to talk about the protection of Dawes' polyarchy of rights. And this is something that's very important because without the polyarchy of rights, which include the right to free speech, the right to vote, the right to assemble, there would be no democratic process as we know it today. And in order to protect those rights, we need a judiciary that is going to be independent in examining cases from both sides of a particular issue. Furthermore, an independent judiciary is going to be an impartial arbiter in cases involving the government. There's more than one case in American and Turkish history where the government and the citizenry were on opposite ends of an argument. However, it's up to an independent judiciary to determine who is right and who is wrong. It would not be good, for instance, if the judiciary sided with the government all the time, because that would mean that that citizens' rights would be squashed. At the same time, if the citizens' rights were, if the citizens won every single case, there would be a weakening of government power that would not be ideal as well. It also provides stability to the mixed democratic regime. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more in this next slide. So what is a mixed democracy or / a mixed government? Well, in short, it's a regime type that combines the purest types of government with others. And this is a political philosophy that goes back to Plato, And he talks about in the Republic 5 absolute forms of government. There's the aristocracy, which is ruled by the most virtuous. There's democracy, which is ruled by the many. There's the timocracy, which discusses rule by honoring time, honoring traditions, and in things that have happened in the past, and running the government as they have been in years past. There's the oligarchy, which is the rule by the few, and there's tyranny, which is ruled by one leader. In the mixed democracy, it mixes three of these different types. It mixes democracy, which is ruled by the many, the tyranny, the rule of just one person, and the aristocracy, the rule of the most virtuous. And we can see this in modern political discourse today. For example, we often see the House of Representatives as the House of the people. This would fall into the category of a democracy. The presidency could be discussed as a tyranny, a more monarchical sort of government. With granted, it does have checks. However, it does have that role in the government today. And then the aristocracy, which one could argue is the judiciary in a sense, the learned people in the court system who know about the laws, about the rules, and are able to judge them effectively. In this theory, according to Plato, the fighting between these factions in the government is going to lead to restrained government power and more peace among citizens. And this makes sense. If the rule of the many is competing against, the rule of the ones, of say, for example, the president, in this political discourse, you're going to have conflict among the House of Representatives and the presidency. But at the same time, that's going to lead to greater rights for the citizens, because no one branch is going to be able to is able to fully dominate one of the other ones. And this is similar to the separation of powers theory developed by Montesquieu, but it's a little bit different because it does still emphasize class differences. It does still, there's just many differences between the two that I'm not gonna get into. I could spend a lot of time talking about today. So I selected a few different principles from the basic principles on the independence of the judiciary. And this is a UN document that was published a few years ago, and it outlines 20 important qualities of an independent judiciary. And for this presentation, I've outlined 6 main ones. The first one, the independence of the judiciary shall be guaranteed by the state and enshrined in the Constitution. And we see this in both Turkey and in the United States. United States, you have Section 3, which is dedicated to discussing the judiciary. There are clauses and articles in the Turkish Constitution of 1982, which discuss this as well. The judiciary shall decide matters before them impartially. Once again, that's talking about the independent judiciary, and as I discussed earlier, how that is so critical for any government, especially one in a mixed democracy, to function. The judiciary shall have jurisdiction over all issues of a judicial nature and shall have exclusive authority to decide whether an issue submitted for its decision is within its competence as defined by law. This is another important thing discussing how if there's something within the judiciary's role, they should be taking an active part in deciding whether a case is fair enough for them to hear and then acting upon it. There will be no inappropriate or unwarranted interference with the judicial process. And this is so critical as well. And this is why the judiciary is a separate branch of the government. It has judicial review to make sure that other branches of the government are abiding by the same rules as everybody else. Persons selected for judicial office shall be individuals of integrity with appropriate training. And this is something that that sometimes I take for granted and a lot of people take for granted, but we're going to explore how this is not necessarily the case sometimes. And lastly, all disciplinary, suspension, or removal proceedings shall determine in accordance with the established standards of judicial conduct. And we're going to explore specifically in the case of the Turkish judiciary, how sometimes this is violated. So this is the case study of Turkey. We have President Erdogan in the top right corner. The executive-centric framework was manipulated by Prime Minister Erdogan in order to gain more power. And there was a person that I cited, he's on this panel today, named Dr. Yunus Ozan, who talked about how initially in 1982, when the Constitution was written, there were military forces involved in the creation of the presidency and in the government as a whole that could serve as a check on the president. However, as the military receded from political issues, this void was absorbed by Prime Minister Erdogan. And another thing I want to discuss as well is that his initial attacks on the judiciary were seen as a positive thing. There were many political opponents, the Kemalists, who were in judicial posts and simply tried to obstruct anything he tried to do because he was in power. And this gave him the fuel that he needed to talk about how the judiciary were corrupt and needed to be reformed. And this led to many different changes, as you can see. The Quiet Revolution, as it's called, over 500 different laws were passed through the parliament and through Prime Minister Erdogan to undermine the judiciary and judicial means to solving problems. But once again, this is where we see an issue where the people obviously were in support of these measures, but they weren't necessarily democratic or good for an independent judiciary. And this is something that we're going to see a lot more when we get to the United States as well. And for some further context, there were some other events such as the December 17th through 25th raids, which threatened President Erdogan and those close to him, the attempted coup in 2016. These two events led to further crackdowns on dissidents, and we're going to look at these a little bit more. President Erdogan and his cabinet can now pick judges without the consent of the legislature. And it's not that the legislature would block any of his picks. The candidates that are running for the legislature now have to pass a certain vetting process, which would make obstruction of one of Erdogan's picks to be very unlikely. However, this is one threat that's posed to judicial independence. Judges can be reassigned and shuffled around without their approval. There are many cases where judges have ruled against the government and they have been moved to lower courts or they've been moved to family courts. And this demotion is really horrible because it shows that the government does not have confidence in these judges to execute the law faithfully. These judges do want to execute the law faithfully. However, they just disagree with the government. And these, like I said, these decisions, when they don't line up with what the government wants, you're going to be moved to a lower court. Some people that are charged can be found not guilty, then rearrested and found guilty. And this is something that I found when reading this one document, the Turkish criminal peace judgeships in international law. There was a specific case in here where there was a political dissident who was found not guilty, and the prosecutor said, I'm going to charge you for using BILOC. And for those of you who do not know what BILOC is, it's a secure messaging system through which the parallel state of Fethullah Gulen was apparently using. And so the accused was escorted out of the courtroom, and about 15 minutes later was arrested for using BILOC. But once again, this is extremely dangerous. This is extremely dangerous, not only for the government and for judicial independence, but for these dissidents as well. It came out a few years ago that over half of people arrested for using BILOC might not have actually used the app, which is very scary in the fact that the Turkish judiciary has not done anything to protect the rights of these citizens. And finally, I want to talk about criminal peace judgeships that were created specifically to weed out the parallel state, as I said. To sum up what the parallel state is, Fethullah Gulen is a man who started the Gulen movement, which was basically a way to spread Turkish culture around the world. He's currently in exile in the Pocono mountain range. And President Erdogan, although very close with him and close with his associates in the beginning of his time in government, went on to attack him and say that he was organizing a parallel state and wanted the government to fail, and therefore it was necessary to create these judgeships to weed out any dissidents who might be responsible for doing whatever Gulen wanted them to do. Okay, so I talked enough about Turkey. I want to move on to the United States of America now, because this is something that is very interesting to me personally. Thinking about how the founding fathers viewed judicial independence. On the left, we have Thomas Jefferson, who favored more judicial accountability to the people. And this is where we see more of a populist thread in his thinking. He argued that life tenure would remove judges from reality, that they would become corrupted, that they wouldn't be in touch with the needs of the citizenry, and that they would ultimately have decisions that would harm the public as a whole. And he supported elections as a way to determine who would be a judge. And this would be, he did not specifically clarify. He did cite some cases in colonial Connecticut where judges were elected to back up his argument. On the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton here, and he acknowledged the structural weaknesses of the judicial branch. One only has to look to Andrew Jackson in Worcester versus Georgia, and him saying, for example, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So Alexander Hamilton knew that the judiciary needed some teeth behind it, and that's why he supported life tenure, that even though a judge might be appointed by a certain president, they would not be influenced by a certain ideology once that president left. And he also thought, and this is where you start to see some an elitist perspective in Hamilton's thinking, thinking that most people would not be able to interpret the law correctly. And this is where we see this this division between the two in terms of Hamilton wanting rule by an aristocracy and seeing this and going back to more of a mixed democratic theory, whereas Jefferson is a little bit more populist in his thinking. And I just have two example quotes right here. The one on the left is from it's from Thomas Jefferson, and he says, "In this, as in many other elections, voters would be guided by reputation, which would not err oftener, perhaps, than the present mode of appointment." So he believed in the power of the people. He thought that even though somebody might be, of a certain political party, their reputation would not taint them in a general election. And you see Alexander Hamilton talking about how, as I said earlier, believing in the mixed democratic regime in terms of the aristocracy representing the judiciary and the democracy representing the will of the people, and so on and so forth. So this is Thomas Jefferson's view, and I want to examine how it worked out. There are popular judicial elections today in the United States because many contentious issues are not being handled by legislatures. Instead, they're being handled by court systems. Abortion rights, environmental policy are putting independent judges in tough spots, especially when they're going to have to put up for election in a few years. And these judges have to put up with decisions about whether to follow state constitutions and state laws and what they truly believe, or whether they want to be elected. And there was one judge who said, as I said down here, "I never felt so much like a hooker down by the bus station as I did in a judicial race. They mean to be buying a vote," which is extremely sad that you have judges who want to be independent, but yet they feel like they can't be because they won't have funding for the next judicial race. And you can see as partisanship in the United States increased, you can see that ads have gotten nastier, more dark money has spread into elections. You can see up here the picture, Judge Robin Hudson, not tough on child molesters. I'm not sure what race this was from, but it just goes to show how low the political discourse has come in popular judicial elections. There's also the politicization of the judiciary. Putting judges on the bench has always been a crucial role of the presidency. And it's something that's been acknowledged. Presidents are going to have different views on who should be on the court, but it was never really politicized. However, in 2016, you saw with the death of Antonin Scalia and Senate Majority Leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, blocking the seat from being filled for over 9 months because conservatives feared losing the Supreme Court. You saw Donald Trump putting out a list of people he would appoint from the Federalist Society, which is an extremely conservative organization, which has a very interesting way of viewing the law, so to speak. And you even see in the Trump administration, the high amount of judgeships filled. In Trump's 4 years in office, he filled 226 seats in 4 years. Barack Obama in 8 years filled 320. And that just goes to show, and you can see this diagram down here, how interesting this is, that if Trump had won 4 more years, he could have practically doubled this impact, he could have appointed over 400 of his judges to benches across the United States. And this threatens independence as well, with a group of judges that might not necessarily be in the mainstream of judicial thought, yet they're being represented over numbers that are high above their proportion in judicial spots across the United States. So in my conclusion, I just want to say that populist instincts have done nothing but undermine independent judiciaries. This was proven in Turkey. This was proven in the United States. And it is tough because, because we pride ourselves in democracy as being, the voice of the people. But sometimes we have to curb those instincts in order to almost save ourselves from ourselves. This curbing these populist instincts, ironically, protects the democracy that we love and enjoy today. And it ensures that the rights that we want and the rights that we're entitled to are protected to the fullest extent possible. And I just want to leave you with a closing thought about how COVID-19 might affect the judiciary's role in government. We've seen in the United States, for example, that the Supreme Court has overturned some state requirements, saying, for example, churches cannot be opened, and this was overruled by the Supreme Court. Will this trend continue? Will the Supreme Court continue to will it become even more active? Will it issue even more rulings, or will it become more reticent in the face of a more executive-centric framework that we're seeing not just in Turkey, but also in the United States as well? Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Shukri, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'll now be sharing my screen.
Okay.
I do want to say in advance that I have younger siblings in my house who love to come into my room. And so if you have any interruptions, just ignore them. Okay. Pardon me as I pull up my script. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shukri Mohammed. I'm a double major in history and peace and global studies. And today I'll be presenting on my honors thesis paper titled Naknol, Political Struggles of Somali Women in the Liberation Movement and Post-Colonial Politics. Before we get started with my paper and the presentation of my paper, I'd first like to point out where exactly Somalia is for those who might not be familiar with the country. It's located on the east coast of Africa, also known as the Horn of Africa, and was an important port, especially during colonialism and post-colonialism, as well as it connected the Mediterranean Sea into the Indian Ocean. With that, the paper is formatted in a way where I introduce the post-colonial feminist theory in my introduction. Then I break the history of Somalia into two parts, looking at colonial Somalia and Somalia under dictatorship. And when I'm talking about colonial Somalia, I'm specifically looking at the Nikah Talyani as a policy. Nikah Talyani is also known as Italian marriages. And then under the dictatorship of Siad Barre, I'll be looking at the family law of 1975 as a policy. And then I also followed by the conclusion. And then also, before I get started on my presentation, I first like to point out that Naknol, which is also present in my title, directly translates to a woman who is alive, and figuratively refers to a woman who can pull herself by the bootstraps, a woman who can do as she says she will, a strong woman at that. And with that, I'll get started with what the premise of my paper, which takes a look at the post-colonial feminist theory. And the post-colonial feminist theory developed to explain the changes that post-colonial women faced. The theory argues that formerly colonized women were oppressed by two systems of power, colonialism and patriarchy. And in talking about patriarchy, it is the notion that men have power over women, while colonialism is a policy where one nation has power and control over another nation. And in the context of Somalia, it was colonized by Italy, Great Britain, France, and Ethiopia. And while a patriarchal system is not a new notion to Somalia as a country, and as many clans, which I'll talk about a little bit, the development of a central government that purposely leaves women out of decision-making processes is and has held the country back from greater development. And so post-colonialism refers to the system and nations that are often forgotten as a result of colonialism because they no longer are affiliated with those colonizing nations. So then the paper then argues that the tenets of colonialism and patriarchy, in addition to the failure to allow Somali women political space, led to unsettled socio-political issues in Somalia, such as political instability and social unrest as viewed from a post-colonial feminist theory perspective. And so we go into the first part of my paper, and I'll do a small overview. So in Somalia, the understanding of by the founding members of the country was that Somali women were supporters rather than partners. And as a result, women were kept in the margins in their involvement in the independence and other socio-political movements that established Somalia as a nation. And in that respect, during the dictatorship later, during the 60s and 70s of Siad Barre, women became puppets and symbols for advancing men's agendas. And for Siad Barre, based on its treatments of women, this meant that the international community legitimately saw Somalia as an independent nation based on its treatment of women. We later find out that this is more so of a symbolic notion rather than actual taking the action in giving women the rights that they deserve. Men took up most of the spaces and offices where decisions were made, while women were expected to continue to uphold traditional colonial roles. Traditional colonial roles I refer to as roles that are that look at childbearing, raising, and maintaining their homes and communities, but leave out the roles that women played pre-colonial. And pre-colonial Somalia was a little clans that existed in the space that is now considered Somalia, and women played essential roles as peacekeepers, specifically in the way that marriages existed. So marriages were a way that connected one clan to another clan, where a daughter of one clan would marry the son of another clan, and there, a peace treaty kind of existed in its space. And so in the traditional colonial roles, women carried out responsibilities which are not seen as important politically because they're not at the center stage of state building. And in the process of state building, men were upholding post-colonial patriarchal systems that viewed women as not valuable for the political advancement of the country. And then going into kind of the Italian administration, which was a huge impact on the development of the country. The administration provided rules and regulations for Somali women. One such example can be seen in the matter of marriage. The colonial processes were engendered in the way that separated the two genders, male and female, and the roles that each played in the greater colonial system. The Italian administration created Italian marriages, also known as nikah Italiani. The regulations broke down the long existing systems of marriage that involved the families and those who wanted to marry. The Italian marriages allowed women to marry without consent from their families as a way of granting women freedom. However, while the practice may seem emancipating, it created problems among the Somali population. They created problems ranging from sexual violence and concubinage to problems of inheritance because half-caste children could only inherit from their native parent rather than their Italian parent. And half-caste members were seen as an abomination to both Somali and Italian communities. These Italian marriages broke down systems of marriage that brought families and clans together, leaving women oftentimes without families to fall back on during hardships, and women thereafter lose their agency. And as a result, the patriarchy that existed prior to colonization that gave women the option of, being peacekeepers, and men and women were living in a kind of symbiotic relationship. It was the same patriarchy that upheld colonial restrictions over women. For example, during the first years of the Somali Republic in 1961, women were allowed to express their feelings through singing, poems, and burambur, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which is a form of dancing and singing and poetry. They were also allowed to attend universities abroad and at home. However, they did not hold political office, nor were they present in the decision-making spaces. Historians such as Hamid Haji Ingris argue that it was due to the infancy of the state. And I argue that it should not have been the infancy of the state. It should not have been a factor in the marginalization of Somali women because women received university degrees the same as men could have, and they could have very well helped develop the country. And the infancy, it really didn't matter because men were also getting their degrees and doing everything women were doing at the same time. Moreover, women such as Faduma Ahmed Ali should have been awarded positions in the government, as they've been part of the struggle and know the internal workings of the government, the society. Likewise, women in rural Somalia, so far we've been talking about urban women, in the rural Somalia, pastoral and agricultural, they were absent in the struggle of women achieving any political say, despite being essential parts of the economy. So the Somali feminist movement, once it developed, became an urban women's issue, which was fought for and by urban women. And this had consequences as it denied women unity on purpose. For women to be heard, both urban and rural women had to unite in a similar way to how women across Africa were resisting and restructuring the power dynamics in post-colonial world that women lived in, specifically in Liberia, that I talk about in my paper, and welcome any questions that you all have about that at a later time. And studies in women history show that women have been just as politicized during important historical epochs as men. Women have long remained important members of society as peacekeepers and political decision makers, specifically Somali women. So then moving on to Somali dictatorship and Siad Barre. Siad Barre came to power in 1961, where he took over from the former presidents. And at that time, the republic was set up, but it was kind of falling apart. And Siad Barre, a general, kind of came to power. And Barre kind of established the Somali Democratic Organization as its head of its feminist and its push for more female representation in government. Barre passed the Family Law of 1975, which allowed women and men to inherit wealth equally following the death of a family member. It restricted polygamy and gave women the right to seek divorce from their husbands. However, the passage of the law created debate among the Somali population between the religious leaders in the community and the secular leaders in government concerning the right granted to women in Islam and the rights that they could acquire through the state. So this is very similar. We saw this with colonial and as nikah Italiani. It was one step forward and two steps backwards. The debate functioned as those two steps backward. The law was clearly helping women find their place in society and political spaces. However, Muslim leaders were against these opportunities primarily because it claimed it was against Islamic jurisprudence. Not only were they against the laws, but also the premise of socialist societies, which made the population equal, where men and women, were equal to a certain extent. And when you're taking a look at the Islamic jurisprudence itself, the Family Law of 1975 is actually not that very far with the way that Sunni Islams follow in the steps of the Prophet and what actually involves with inheritance, polygamy, and divorce as well. In a way, they were very much restricting the way that women could do what they could in respective to state and what they could do for themselves as well. So the purpose of the law was to give women some power and status within Somali society. The law gave women access to education, economic opportunities. However, it still marginalized women in politics. In 1975, the Somali Women's Democratic Organization was created as a division within the government. Hawa Tako, who here's her picture once again. She is also on the $100 bill in Somalia. She was a very important woman who played a role in colonial Somalia, but her picture was mostly used during the Somali dictatorship and the creation of an organization called Hoyoyinka Gaanka, which were tools that the regime used to portray an image of the equality of genders. To protect their lives, though, women in higher positions that Siad Barre offered showed support for the regime. Unfortunately, the law did not do as much as it should have, primarily because of how militaristic the state was becoming. The more militaristic the nation state became, the more the rights of citizens were violated, especially the rights of women. Siad Barre gave women some rights, which they were able to make use of. Women were able to go to school and find skills as businesswomen and more, but still they were very much marginalized in politics and in decision-making spaces, as they couldn't make any decision-making spaces. Coming to kind of like the conclusion, Dr. Ritu Tyagi, who's an important scholar in post-colonial feminist theory, stated that the theory concentrates on the construction of gender differences in colonial and anti-colonial discourses, the representation of women in anti-colonial and post-colonial discourses. The construction that Tyagi talks of is in reference to colonists' construction of identity in colonies. And for those who are familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism, he describes how colonialism and imperialism created the so-called other in opposition and contrasting European norms, especially gender norms in third world or developing countries. However, instead of the written work that Tyagi references in her work, the construction of gender differences and their lack of representation could most clearly be seen in how administrative systems control women in what they could and could not do, especially here in Somalia's case. The colonial powers were clear in what the colonized subjects were able to do under their watchful administrative officers, because they were under the guise that Africans were not capable of ruling themselves and had to be placed under European tutelage in order to become civilized. And that's where they used women or men in the Somali societies to kind of look over the women, and men at that point kind of ran with it, like, oh, okay, we are now in charge of our society that we've created. So now kind of moving on to modern day. So we're now in the midst of the 2021 now election in Somalia, which is very much in turmoil. However, when we're looking at it specifically from a post-colonial feminist theory and looking at it from a woman's perspective, there haven't been any women running for the presidency. However, in 2016, the election saw female candidates running for the position. Despite neither women, it was a telling affirmation for the future of women in Somali politics and the offices they could occupy. As the women's movement in Liberia in 1990s asked, does the bullet know the Christian from a Muslim? Similarly, is good decision-making differentiated based on the gender of a woman? A good decision is not decided based on the gender of somebody. When a war decision is made, it affects men and women. Men lose their lives, but women are left without sons, fathers, and more. It is said that the death affects those who are living more than those who have died, which is why the decision-making processes need to be even more inclusive in Somalia. Today, Somalia faces problems from threats of Al-Shabaab terrorists, young men who are mothered by Somali women. And these women should be given space and guidance so they can speak and help bring stability to the country. In instances where Somalia was faced with instability, women became providers, the backbone of society. They were peace brokers between clans as marriage partners during times of turmoil, and they were preservers of tradition and knowledge. And it is with this sentiment that I argue women were and are today important political actors who can assist in the success of the political government. In order for Somali women to be part of that success, they must come together and remain together despite dividing factors such as clanism in order to win more governmental positions and become important members of the future of Somalia today. For Somalia to be successful as a country socially, politically, and economically, more women must be in government positions and part of the decision-making process. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I sincerely hope that you all take a good look at the role that women play, not only in Somalia, but in the larger context as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Shukri. It's now Donald's turn.
Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donald Boyd. I'm a junior at Lemoyne College studying political science and minoring in Middle Eastern and economics. And today I'll be presenting on commercial surrogacy and human rights, a case for global regulation. But before diving into the extent of the paper, I'll be showing you a layout of the presentation. So first, I'll be defining key terms. And then afterwards, I'll be showing an illustration of the global representation of surrogacy, and also be talking about the interests, the countries that I chose to research on regarding surrogacy, Afterwards, I'll be talking about the human rights violations, that is in reference to commercial surrogacy. And then lastly, I'll be stating why there needs to be global regulations concerning the market. So the keywords, surrogacy. This is a method of assisted reproduction where intended parents work with a surrogate who will carry and care for their babies until birth. And there are two types of surrogacy, of gestational and traditional. Gestational is the process by which the embryo is fertilized outside of the womb and then placed into the surrogate's womb. And then traditional, this is when the surrogate's egg is used, which is then fertilized with the intended father's sperm. This makes the surrogate have a biological connection with the child. And then there are two forms of way that you can actually get this get a child through whether the different types of surrogacy. You have altruistic surrogacy and you have commercial surrogacy. Altruistic is when there are no monetary compensation that is offered to the surrogate, and for commercial, it is the surrogate is paid for her services. So for the worldview of commercial surrogacy, as they are denoted by colors that states the legal representation of surrogacy. So dark blue, such as Russia and like Texas and other US states, it demonstrates that both gainful and altruistic forms are legal. The gray blue, which is mostly your Latin American countries like Chile, Paraguay, and some Central American, it shows that no legal regulation is there. Light blue, such as South Africa, India, Australia, Canada, and India, shows that it's only altruistic, it's legal. Lavender, as you can only see in Brazil, is allowed between relatives up to the second degree of consanguinity. And red means that there are no, it is not legal, it's not legal there, such as China, you have Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And for the gray countries, which you can see mostly in African nations, there are in the Caribbean, there are no uncertain situations, and also it's unregulated. So therefore you can do it without any form of governmental oversight. So the countries of interest that I'll be presented on is the United States of America, and it'll be taken in this format where I'm going to be talking about United States of America first, India, Ukraine, and Malaysia. So for the United States, so commercial surrogacy was prohibited in New York, and if the intended parents were caught, and the surrogates would be objected to $500 fine, while agency who helped intended parents would be fined $10,000. However, that was revoked this year, where Governor Andrew Cuomo passed the gestational surrogacy law, allowing families from the LGBT communities and others to expand their family. However, in California, commercial surrogacy is legal. The highest you can pay for surrogacy services is $130,000. And as you can see here, I have gotten this representation from the West Coast Surrogacy, which shows you the breakdown of the costs. So for the light gray, it will be medical services. For this look greenish bluish is gestational surrogacy compensation. So that's how much the surrogate will be paid. They also get psychological support and so forth. However, in India, India's medical industry is worth $2.3 billion, and of that, 500 million out of that is achieved by commercial surrogacy. However, that has changed 2 years ago. I started this paper in 2018, so things have changed. They did this because there had been a highlight of mistreatment to the surrogates and babies being formed. However, before it had been banned, on average, there would be like 10,000 foreigners each year would travel to India in order to take a baby. And I would like to break down the costs. So one kid could cost 600,000 rupees, which is equivalent to $9,500 for a foreign couple and twins. 750,000 rupees, which is $12,000. As you can see here, compared to the United States, where you have to pay one of the highest is 130, it is significantly cheaper to get a child in India. And as consumers, you will always look for the cheapest option. And then I have a graphical representation here. This might have changed, which shows the year 2016 to 2030, the trajectory of how big or how much further will the commercial surrogacy expand in the future. So in 2016, the most clinics in India was fertility clinics. Second to that was hospitals. And then they expect an expansion in 2023 And this is a really high expansion. And they said here the IVF, which is vitro fertilization, was valued at 256 million in 2016, and is estimated to reach 829.5 million by 2023. So going on to Ukraine. So surrogacy in Ukraine is not regulated, and the Ukraine's health minister does not keep official records of surrogacy or statistics. Intended parents can choose the gender of their baby, which is illegal in some countries such as Spain. And on average, a foreign couple can get a surrogate between $11,000, which is equivalent to 10,000 euros, and 15,000 to 15,000, which is equivalent to 14,000 euros. However, the biggest surrogacy clinic in Ukraine right now is called Biotechcom. It controls 2/3 of the surrogacy market in Ukraine, with foreigners as its main consumers. However, the owner, Albert Tokolosi, sorry if I have butchered his name, was put under house arrest for child trafficking. And Biotech is known for human trafficking of babies that have no genetic link to intended parents. On to the next country would be Malaysia. So Malaysia, surrogacy is legal, but it's not regulated. When the intended parent no longer cares about purchasing the child that they were going through the process, these traffickers will sell them on the internet. Some traffickers charge up to $2,500 to purchase a baby with falsified birth documents. And in order to make an illegal document look legal, traffickers would make payments or bribe the police officers for them to sign statutory declarations as a witness, and they would also have corrupt doctors who charge the biological mother's name on the prenatal record and would submit it to the government registry. So I would like to present an example of which was caught. So this is called the under the table dealings between doctors and government officials. So a clinic in Malaysia called Gamma Medic, one of the leading surrogacy clinics in Malaysia, would charge $2,375 for delivering charges and falsified birth certificates. And in each of the Jabatan Pendaftaran Negara, these are government agencies that work on the birth certificate of babies. They have roughly 8 individuals who would pay them. They would pay them in order for intended parents to get birth certificates so they can take the child out of the country. So now I want to address how commercial surrogacy does have human rights violations. So first, I would like to talk on the surrogate. So just like in the United States have a lot of regulatory measures to protecting surrogates in the country. However, countries such as India, Malaysia, and other in developing nations that do not typically monitor them well, the surrogate, they typically go for women in slums or impoverished communities. And because of the desperation of needing economic gain, and some of these women are illiterate, so they don't understand the contract, and therefore they can be cheated out of it. Additionally, due to the ban of commercial surrogacy in India, a lot of the surrogate clinics have moved out of India to neighboring countries such as Cambodia. And what they do, they take pregnant Indian women and then transport them to the other countries so they can actually get what needs to be done. However, this does not guarantee the safety and protection of these women. And oftentimes they're exploited, they're not paid well. Additionally, if a child is stillborn or there was a miscarriage, they don't get paid. And the human rights violation is because you are playing with women's reproductive systems, and women go through a lot of changes through pregnancy, and the fact that you are not paying them for their services is a huge economic disadvantage for them. Additionally, for children, however, there was a case in India in which the clinic would like to ensure that the intended parents do get a child. So what they would do is pump the surrogate with multiple embryos. However, multiple fetuses would start to develop. And some of the times they would abort some, others, they would actually sell them. And this now is human trafficking, because now you're selling the body. And if that child is not bought by a domestic couple are international, they will be sold into begging and sex syndicates. An example of that would be Pulatan in Thailand, in which the babies are sold to a sex syndicate. They'll groom them until the age of 8, and they'll be used for sexual pleasures. Additionally, for the babies that are there, if the child is born, say for instance, when for instance, an Indian surrogate leaves the country and goes to another country, where if you're not born a native, the child born will be stateless. So since the child is stateless, they are refused from getting the proper educational needs and medical services. So why there needs to be global regulations concerning commercial surrogacy. So I'm going to break it down into the child sector and then to women. For children, it will ensure the protection of children passing borders. And it will ensure that these children do not become stateless. Additionally, the government will be ensuring that there are necessary resources for the children. So they'll be doing extensive investigations into these parents who are taking them out of different countries to their native lands. And the government can track and monitor parents and see where they actually are getting these children from. Additionally, employing people within government agencies to ensure there's no falsification of birth certificates, as well as going into these surrogacy clinics to ensure that there's no malpractice going on. For the woman, it's ensuring that they are paid before the child is given to the intended parents, therefore they're not cheated out of a contract. Additionally, government agencies monitoring pregnant women, surrogates specifically, crossing borders to ensure that they are safe within that country. And then, so my conclusion is surrogacy should not be banned. The recruiters, clinics, and human traffickers will not disappear. They will only become smarter in their dealings. Women and children would still be harmed. However, surrogacy should be carefully regulated within each country and clearly guided across nations by an international treaty. A common agreement between countries that legalizes and regulates surrogacy is necessary and long overdue to ensure that all parties are treated fairly and ethically in the process of surrogacy arrangements wherever they occur around the world. So this is the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Okay, I was already unmuted, so thank you for the presentations. They were all very good, and nobody exceeded the time limit. So I have a few comments on each paper. What we can do, if you want, is you can answer these. I can give you another, these are some comments and questions. You don't need to answer all of them, obviously. You can all have a few minutes to answer these comments, and also afterward, maybe we can have a bit more open questions that you can ask questions to each other. But first, I will speak for a little bit, and then you will have one more round of right to speak. You don't, not a necessity to speak, okay? So the first, I will go with the same order, James's paper. This, first of all, it was a very clear and well-written paper, and on a topic that is of great interest to me. And the comparison of Turkey and the US is very interesting, and I would say very apt. But still, about that case selection, I would say there needs to be some justification. I think it's there already, that you seem to frame the issue as Turkey as a country that is one of the paradigmatic examples of current autocratization. And so as a country that went through certain stages of autocratization and weakening of judicial independence and breakdown of democracy, right? So US is not at the same level, but Turkey provides a perspective. But something like that would be good to introduce in the introduction section of the paper, some kind of case selection justification. The main argument is of the paper is that executive-centric framework with a populist movement has endangered the modern judicial systems in modern democracies. The argument is pursued well in the paper, and but still, of course, I have some comments about the argumentation. First comment is the status of the concept of populism in your paper. I will say is a little bit ambiguous. The status of the concept of populism in the paper. So it would benefit from clarification on that issue. I think the paper will benefit from clarification on that issue. So if we removed populism and interjected with that instead authoritarian leadership, I would say still your paper would work, which suggests that the concept of populism and populist leadership, the choice of using those concepts need to be justified, and a little bit of clarification. It's not a big word, I would say, but I think correctly, at least to me, it sounds very reasonable that you use the words like populist instincts and sometimes populist movements. So it would be better for the reader to know what you exactly mean in those to connect better with the argument, the concept, right? The second criticism is that independent judiciary and impartial judiciary are used almost synonymously. Independent and impartial. They are a little different. They refer to different parts of the literature, I would say. Even if they do not refer to different parts of the literature, paper would benefit from clarifying those two concepts: impartial judiciary and independent judiciary. They are not necessarily, they do not necessarily mean the same thing. So it's not that it is making the paper weaker, but it will make the paper stronger, I think, if you clarify the relationship and those two concepts. Thirdly, I think for I'm referring to the paper, not the presentation, obviously, in my comments. I believe it will be better to locate the argument within the academic literature in the introduction of the paper or argumentation part of the paper. So like in the literature, there is this autocratization and judicial independence literature, the general literature, and they talk about these mechanisms for the weakening of judicial independence and politicization of the judiciary. So Turkish and US case studies, contribute to this. Like at the beginning, it will be nice to see for the reader, I think, to see where this paper is located. Anyway, I believe that overall, with a little bit more bolstering with references, this is a very promising paper that could be developed into a good article. About presentation, I don't have any comments on the presentation. It was very clear, I would say. A few slides were a little bit wordy. That's the only thing. Like maybe like I don't know, for viewers, for the audience, it would be better to put less words on some of the slides. But other than that, it was very good. So the Shukri's paper. So also one last question, James. What do you think? This is like a large question. Do you think the US is going, the path that US is going through is going to be like Turkey's path or Hungary's path? Do you think the US is on the same path with the other countries that have lost almost judicial independence completely? What do you think about the US's political development in that sense? That's my question to you. Maybe you can answer it after my comments for the other two papers.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. No problem. The Shukri's paper, again, it's a very informative paper. It's a very densely written paper. Densely, I'm not using in a negative sense, it's a positive thing, I would say, based on good research. I learned a lot from it, but I have a few comments, obviously. First of all, the paper's introduction, paper is clearly located within the post-colonial feminist literature. Still, I think introduction could be a little clearer. It is a little bit like, it has a little bit of a convoluted way of expressing. So it could be a little bit, if it were a little bit tighter, it would help the reader, I would say, to follow the paper more easily, for the rest of the paper more easily. So you could make it like very clearly, like, you know, so the theory is this, the case is that, and then I am following the case with this theories, concepts this way. So like it's a bit clearer presentation would help the reader, I think, follow the paper. So another one is that the paper does a very good job in outlining the impact of colonial policies on the gender relations in Somalia, and on the evolution of patriarchy and the deepening of unequal relationships, gender relationships, due to colonial policy. So that part is, I don't know, I'm convinced, but however, I'm still ambivalent about the impact of the post-colonial and post-independence politics on the status of women in Somalia, especially the impact of the Siad Barre's secularizing the scientific socialist dictatorial rule. In the presentation, you said 2 steps, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward. Because of the woman's exclusion from decision-making spaces. But it felt a little bit like, to me, that it felt a little bit more like 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. But, you know, so I'm not so sure that even with the concepts provided by post-colonial feminist literature, it is fair to, from the presentation, I don't know the case obviously, but from your presentation even, I'm not sure it's fair to interpret it as such. 2 steps backward, I don't know. What would you may want to respond to it and, you know, convince me or convince the other members of the audience on that issue. So so it seemed to, because like when you are talking about the colonial policies impact on the Somalian society, it's not only exclusion of women from political spaces, but it's also exclusion, the downgrading of the woman's position in social relations, right? And what the dictatorship, secularizing scientific socialist, quote unquote, you use it, quote unquote, scientific socialist dictatorship did was actually more progress in the social relations without much progress in the political involvement of women. So the yardstick that you use for the colonial policy is slightly different than the one that you use for the dictatorial period, I would say. Yeah, right, social and political, if you think like that. I'm not sure, but, you know, I'm putting it out there. So and one more I have, colonial policies, the 4th one is, do colonial policies, like at the end of the paper, you talk about the Al-Shabaab terrorists and their and Islamist involvement, Islamist reaction, backlash to first Islamist backlash to Barre's secularizing policies, right? And then Al-Shabaab's and political Islamists actions more recently. So do colonial policies still have something to do with these aspects of gender relations? So do colonial policies still have the power to determine gender relation now in those struggles, like current struggles between Islamists and secularizing forces, maybe, I don't know. So it's been like, what, 60 years? 60 years, the direct colonial policies were 60 years or so, 50 something, 60 years, right? So do they still have power to causally impact? If yes, how? So like, can those two periods be connected? Or is it just Islamists are being Islamists and doing what Islamists do, independent of the colonial policies, right? So that's, and my last comment, I promise, is that case selection could be justified. I mean, it is clear, it's very interesting, and but you could say it's a single case study, and you could justify it that, you know, like Somalian case, this case study, in-depth case study of the Somalian case enables us to see, to test maybe post-colonial feminist theories, certain assumptions or certain concepts driven from that theory is tested well in Somalian case, because Somalian case had periods of colonial rule, direct colonial rule, indirect colonial rule, but also secularization periods, etc. Like some kind of justification of the case study would be nice. All right. So, okay, the last one is the last one. That's all. The last one is Donald's paper. This is also a very interesting paper on a novel topic, probably novel. I don't know. It's new to me. Obviously, I have not read papers on international politics and comparative politics on those issues before. It is my comments. I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I'm taking as much time as you do, so I should just like be quite quicker a little bit here. So the first comment is that the introduction, I think, should be more robust. It could be with a clear presentation of the literature on the issue, academic literature on the issue. If there is no such academic literature, which I suspect there may not be, a political science literature on the issue, if there is no such literature, you can also just mention the lacunae, like the lack of that such literature. But in the introduction, it should be there somehow and mentioned. But I would also say that the moral dilemma that you mentioned on pages 7, 8, referring to Sandal's political theory, could be the main frame of the paper, right? The main frame of the paper. So you could introduce it in the introduction, that moral dilemma, and you could position the paper within that moral dilemma, right? And you can also add a little bit to that dilemma, how it is discussed in political theory. So like you could make it a bit more literature grounded that way. But also human rights literature. You can use human rights literature that you refer to at the end. Human rights literature also could be the literature about that you locate your own paper. The second is, I would say you could have delved deeper on the issue of international treaty on surrogacy, the need for an international treaty for your surrogacy, as you mentioned at the end. By maybe you could make you could give examples and study maybe comparative cases with similar controversial issues that ended up with international regulations, treaties, etc. So like it should not be surrogacy, but similar cases like that did not have international regulation, but they ended up having it at the end. Like I don't know which cases would that be, but you know, it would be like, so surrogacy is like these other cases that developed international regulations. When there is a need, international regulations develop this way. So that would bolster, I think, your claim at the end that there is a need for international treaty, because there were international treaties, international regulations on similar cases as such. That's what this is just a suggestion, obviously. And finally, case selection, I think, could be justified a little. And because you choose Ukraine, Malaysia, right? Why did you choose those 4 cases, right? Those 4 cases. Maybe you could have justified that by saying that they look like they are prominent cases. I mean, that's clearly why. But you should mention why you chose those 4, and why that case selection helps you understand this issue better. Something like that helps us. So I have, of course, in questions like I asked to James, to all of you, but I will not take more time. We can maybe discuss between each other later. So I'm muting myself, and you all have a few minutes to talk about.
Dr. Sozen,
Yeah, I muted myself. Sorry. Maybe like 4 minutes each, max, let's say. Yeah.
Shall we go in the order that we presented?
Yeah. James, let's start with James, and then Shukri, and then Donald.
Okay, so I'll just address your question first, Dr. Sozen. I've been thinking about it for the past few minutes. I don't know if I would say that the United States is heading down the same path as Turkey. However, I would argue that we're heading down the path of a more polarized judiciary. And as you were explaining your comments, one thing I think I could have explained better with populism is the singularization of elections, right? And how certain, for example, with President Trump, if you're voting for President Trump, by extension, you are voting for his Supreme Court nominees. You are voting for the people that he is putting on the federal bench. I think that's something that's important. I could have expanded upon in the paper. So back to the original question, I just see the judiciary becoming more and more of a tool for political candidates to justify why they should be elected. And you can see this, for instance, in terms of where lawsuits are placed. For example, with the Affordable Care Act, Republicans filed a lawsuit in Texas. And this is because, judges in Texas are more conservative. Likewise, when Democrats opposed some of Donald Trump's measures, they went to, for example, the Ninth Circuit, which is known for a more liberal bend. So I see the judiciary in the United States in the future not as becoming more of an extension of one particular ruler, but as a certain political ideology that will be used to advance one's causes, and then therefore the fight over judicial seats is going to become very important, not just in judicial elections, but also in the appointment process as well.
Yeah, and I'll also address 2 of the questions Professor Sozen also presented. The first one I also have been thinking about for a while, with the 2 steps back or 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think when we're looking at it from a overall social perspective, I think it is a matter of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward for women. But when we're looking at it from a political perspective, in what women have to kind of what they have access to in terms of politics and policies and decision-making processes, I think it is a matter of, 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards, especially when it comes to social norms. And I guess this kind of goes to your next question, Professor Sozen, where you asked me, do colonial policies have to do with modern gender relations? In a sense, they do, especially when you take a look at what is socially acceptable to do, what is socially not acceptable to do. And I think especially in the Somali society, which I also am a part of, I'm Somali American, it could be very restricting for a Somali woman to go into politics or to do anything that is outside of what is considered what is normally genderly normal, especially with decision making, politics being such a masculine kind of space. It's when a woman invades that space, it's kind of seen as, oh, she's doing something incredibly kind of strange. And I saw a little bit of that with the elections this year, and it's still going on, the Somali 2020-2021 now elections. And I was having a discussion with my aunts, and they brought up the fact, and I asked, oh, are there any women who are running for president? They were like, a woman running for president? You look like that's a crazy top. Like, why would you ever even think to bring that up? And I'm just kind of looking around like, wow, there's so many other countries. I don't remember which African nation it was that had like 50% of its cabinet members were women. And I was like, oh, like, but here we are in Somalia. And I want to say like, we have almost zero to none, none to zero, which is pretty much none, women in political spaces where they actually need to be. And I also saw that sometimes women are in political spaces or positions where they're once again in those like traditional roles, like they'll get the I forget the title, but it has to do with education. And once again, it's kind of like a woman space almost. It's like, oh, now you have to take care of a woman, but from a political perspective. And once again, that's also a gendered space. So that, I think that was pretty interesting, and that it's interesting that you brought that up, because it's been it's something I've been considering while I've been writing this paper for the past like 2 years.
Donald, you want to say something? You don't have to. Nobody has to do anything.
One thing I would say is just be very careful of what you choose to purchase, and especially when it comes to human rights violations with things. Especially because, for instance, no one knew that you seriously could, like, you're selling babies. You could go on Facebook and Instagram and you can just find babies for sale, as simple as that. And I feel as if we have to be cautious about what we put our money with value with, no matter how desperately you need it. Is it the right thing to do? So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, the last point. So like in the introduction, that dilemma, I think you can open up with that dilemma in the paper, and you can actually also bolster that dilemma with a bit more literature, because that's, I think, a framing that this paper fits very well. This paper fits very well. Any other questions that you have for each other that you may, yeah.
I have a question for Shukri and James. So first one, James, why did you choose that topic?
So I chose Turkey and the United States. I'm very interested in the region. I had Dr. Souza for comparative politics in the fall, and obviously it's of great interest to him. It was interesting. I wanted to explore why, like he said in his comments, how is the United States going down the same path as Turkey? Turkey has gone through a lot more democratic backsliding than the United States has, but whether it will come true for the United States, if there's going to be a reversal, or if there's going to be a stagnation with the political polarization in the judiciary that I also talked about. That's why I chose that.
And Shukri, I'm more interested in the family, I wrote it down somewhere here. When you were talking about the family law, is it still something that's in operation, or is it just that the implications of it still rest within the minds of people, and how women also internalizes misogyny themselves?
No, that's an interesting question. I haven't explored how that law has kind of transitioned, but generally, just from speaking with my aunts, uncles, and everyone kind of basically around me, the internalized misogyny and patriarchy is still very much within the community and within the country as well. So you can kind of see remnants of it if it's totally gone. And that's definitely something that I'll be looking into for further research. But definitely, the implications of the family law are still kind of there. And even the debate that it's kind of struck is still a debate that goes on all the time. Like, who is able to inherit? Can a woman inherit all of something? When the divorce happens, I think divorce is more, it's recognized as something that can happen, but it still has that stigma where, a woman should not divorce her husband because, traditionally you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be doing that. So I think that the instilled misogyny and patriarchy that's so, deeply embedded into the Somali society, it's still kind of something that holds up the family law to an extent.
Thank you guys.
And I also have a question for you, Danelle, and I messaged it to you as well. How is the United Nations involved, or any other like national organizations? Have they been involved in the whole, trafficking, especially when it comes to children when they're so young?
So I know that I'm gonna try my best to answer this just based on what I have researched. Maybe there's more information out there that I have not gotten to. But I know for the 37 conference, the human rights, they've been calling for international regulations with members, and they have also gave recommendations of how to maintain those treaties. However, there still needs signatures to it and veto. I know there was a part on the UN program or organization in the United Nations that focus on human trafficking itself. And they are actively working on helping people, especially those that they find crossing borders, to change. But it's really difficult for them because there's something called Stockholm syndrome, where they are like, the victims are very much dependent on their traffickers. So it's really difficult to truly help people who have been in that situation for years. But I need to still do more reading on it and more research on it, so I cannot answer to the extent, but I'm hoping to continue, because I know that laws and regulation constantly change. For instance, in India, it was legal, and then recently they banned it based on a lot of coverage on it. So I just have to keep on paying attention and reading more. Thanks.
All right, I think we have exhausted our discussions. So this was a very interesting panel. I learned a lot from all of your papers, and I think this was a panel where all the papers were very strong and presentations were extremely clear. Thank you very much for participating into New York State Political Science Association, and looking forward to seeing you later. Bye.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, Dr. Sozen.
You too.